Welcome to Convivial Conservation around the globe. I'm Eliana, your host, and today is our very first episode of this podcast series, and I'm really excited. So in this podcast, I'll introduce you to the Convivial Conservation Initiative, and by talking with convivial conservation researchers, we will explore their research and discuss the key ideas beyond this stream of convivial conservation. So if you're interested in nature, sustainability, political ecology, or simply want to know what is happening around you, keep listening because this podcast is for you. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me two amazing researchers, Revati from India and George connecting from the Netherlands. Revati Pandya, she is a researcher interested in community dynamics, intersectionality, and political dimensions of conservation. With her, I will discuss their study case from the book Convivial Conservation, From Principles to Practice, entitled Micropolitics and the Prospects for Convivial Conservation, Insights from the Corbett Tiger Reserve, India. So welcome, Revati. Welcome on board. I'm really excited that you're here. How are you?
Thank you so much, Eliana, for inviting me. And I'm excited to talk about this case and also hear about George's case and just have a nice conversation about good conservation.
Amazing. Thank you. And just right away, can you give us a brief summary of your research and what it's all about?
Sure. So the research I'll be describing today is about a Corbett Tiger Reserve and specifically looking at forest villages that lie on the vicinity of the Corbett Tiger Reserve. So it's a protected area which is very exclusionary, and forest villages are the kind of designation where you don't have rights to the land. So these are villagers who don't actually have any formal recognition, and they have been people living either in the forest and have been relocated or migrated there for a few generations now. And I was looking to understand what is it about their rights that can be made better. So if there is exclusionary conservation and if we work on forest access and also land rights, which they don't have, through the Forest Rights Act in India, which is a very progressive law that gives and grants access and also acknowledges historical injustice for villagers that are tribals or local forest dwellers. So how do we really look at convivial conservation from that perspective? Because the Forest Rights Act is something that is convivial, but how do we consider the existing micropolitics, which is things like gender and caste, which are really strong and which are actually causing a lot of power dynamics in these forest villages as well. So can we really think about something that's convivial when we consider micropolitics? So what I found finally is that one has to, of course, consider these micropolitics, but in a way that is more explicit than just saying like, hey, women need to be included. Hey, there's someone from a lower caste that needs to be included. So that's the broad perspective, and I can go into details with the more with questions that come up.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That is really interesting, and I'm excited to hear more. Next, we have George Iordachescu. He's a political ecologist researching the politics of conservation and just environmental future, specifically within the European Union context. And with him, we will discuss the case study, Convivial Conservation Prospects in Europe, from wilderness protection to reclaiming the commons. George, thank you so much for joining. I'm excited to hear about your research. How are you?
Hello, Eliana. Hello, Revati. I am very happy and very grateful for this invitation. I've been looking up to Revati's research, and it was very inspiring, and I'm happy to engage more directly with her thoughts today. And I'm grateful for being part on this podcast, which will bring a step further into the discussions of convivial conservation, and hopefully will bring these discussions also more in the European context, where I'm working at the moment and where I plan to foster these exchanges in the future as well.
Can you also give us a bit of a summary of your research?
Very briefly, my research related to conservation looks at alternatives forms of conservation, alternatives regimes of taking care of the environment, not necessarily having conservation as the first aim in the way we understand it from a Western-centric perspective. I am very interested in this just forms of doing conservation, where decision making is taken from locally mostly, where people take great pride in their place and in the rich biodiversity territories they have been co-producing, and how this rich biodiversity is entangled with an environmental history. And mostly I do this research in marginal areas of Europe, and the case we are discussing today comes from Romania, from southeastern Transylvania, in a minority ethnic group, settlers, which are Hungarian speaking. And I am very interested how their long history of taking care of the environment resulted not only in novel ways of taking care for the environment, but also establishing rules to use some of the things around, such as forest or grazing lands and so on, in a certain way that takes into account the needs of future generations, but also the non-human.
Thank you so much for giving us this brief summary, and I'm excited to hear more. And thank you both for giving this great introduction of your research. So before digging into your research and convivial conservation, I would like to give introduction to the audience about the world of conservation generally. So for those of you who are less familiar with environmental conservation is the practice of protecting the natural environment and conserving natural resources, and where possible to repair damage, which I would like to add mostly caused by humans. And today there are many streams of conservation, many ideas of what conservation should be like and what it should protect. And convivial conservation is but one stream in a broader river of movements, struggles, and ideas that seek to overcome the unsustainable and inequitable status quo, which is the conditions in the present time. So convivial comes from the Latin word convivial, which means living with, and its final goal is to create a more equal and sustainable world by implementing a set of principles included in its manifesto, which you can find in the Convivial Conservation website. And it's a set of 10 different points that describe what convivial conservation is about. But to understand better what convivial conservation is about, it's important to see how this notion and ideas work in practice. And for this reason, I now would like to talk with my two guests about their research and how their research relates to convivial conservation. So the first question I would like to ask both is how your research, which you briefly just described, relates to convivial conservation and its principles, and which of these principles were implemented or were showcased in your research. Revati, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. So in a sense, my research context is perhaps everything what's not right with conservation, in terms of just a very rigid conservation structure, historical dispossession, as well as a colonial legacy that is taking place in this context, along with a lot of forms of wildlife tourism, where there has been detachment from livelihoods and land as well for the local communities. So in that sense, how I approached this site was to look at what can be made better, right? And who are the most dispossessed? And that's, as I mentioned earlier, are the forest villagers who historically have been disadvantaged also because of caste, and for not having rights to their land, and also access to the forest for their livelihood. So they have been historically dispossessed. And so in that sense, I think that the first manifesto point about promoting an integrated conservation space and where humans and other animals can coexist, I think is very fitting in a sense for an aspirational vision for Corbett Tiger Reserve, especially because these are communities who have been sharing spaces and continue to do so with wildlife. You have tigers, you have elephants among the big wildlife who are coming into those spaces. And so why is that happening in a time when they don't even have rights to do anything about their own land, or about, if they need to relocate, why are they not being considered as well? So that's one point, leading to the other point about decolonizing conservation practice in general, because this is a very colonial form of protected area that's been taking place, set up in the name of a colonial officer like Jim Corbett. So this legacy also needs to shift. And for all of those reasons, I do feel that the Forest Rights Act in India can be integrated in a sense, and it relates to many points from the manifesto, the principles about actually giving back historical access to the forest, and also rights to living on the land. So you have individual forest rights or community forest rights. And of course, these are dependent on what the community likes or prefers in terms of actually claiming the rights, right? But even within this context, you have so many local differences, like women. Of course, it's a very patriarchal society. So even access to jobs, education, healthcare has been minimal as compared to many men. And then if you are a caste woman or a caste man, then even more dispossessed. So while you can introduce something like the Forest Rights Act, or another form of convivial conservation, can we really think about making it more equitable for the women or people from the caste backgrounds that have been even more dispossessed? So in that sense, it's also challenging dominant forms of political power, which again relates to the Convivial Manifesto. So how do we think about that? So in that sense, my case kind of tried to integrate both these aspects of what's happening and what could be done aspirationally. And I think most of the points of the manifesto can relate to this in a way that things can shift in different aspects of people's lives, but considering the micropolitics.
Thank you for explaining that brilliantly. That is really interesting to hear how the situation is about and how it relates to convivial conservation principles. So now, George, if you want to also answer to the question.
With pleasure. Thanks a lot, Eliana. Pretty much like in Revati's case, convivial conservation is not very popular in Romania, where this case comes from, or in Europe in general. And with this case study and this work, I try to discuss how these ideas about conviviality could be adapted by learning from already functioning just alternatives to mainstream conservation that we find in margins of Europe, which are these areas that suffer from underdevelopment, but are also biodiversity rich, suffer from land abandonment and out-migration, but also no return of the non-human, like large carnivore population and so on. So the case of that I talk, Homorod Koroconi Folvo in Hungarian, or Christmas Village in Romanian, is this very small community, in a very picturesque valley in southeastern Transylvania. They identify as secular. They are a subgroup of Hungarian-speaking people of ethnic minority in Romania, but the area is very rich, has a very rich silvopastoral culture, and the community takes great pride in their territory. Even from the medieval times, their rights over the forests and pasture lands were recognized by the Hungarian king, and up to the 19th century, they were organized in sort of a feudal communal village where decisions were taken as a group related to what kind of timber should be exploited and when and so on. Both the forest and pastures and water sources are governed by community institutions as commons. This is a particular legal category that functions in Europe as well, mostly around the margins. We find them in Scotland, we find them in Spain, we find them in the Alps, in the Nordic countries and so on, mostly at the fringes of legal systems. They have an elected executive committee which functions according to bylaws, and decisions are taken by the General Assembly and so on. So most of the resources so-called resources of the territory are governed according to this decision-making at the local level. There are a couple of principles from the Convivial Conservation manifesto that work in this case, but I think the second principle about collectively owned territory is one of the strongest. In the case that I'm describing, there is another principle, Principle 8, where biodiversity is valued for their spiritual attachment, or it has cultural significances. And this holds for the Homorod Korochoni Folvo case, because the mineral waters around the territory have healing properties, so many locals consider them as having spiritual values to them. They have festivals to honor these healing powers and so on, which are also occasions for the villagers to meet. The territory is also very important to see how we can share these culturally rich landscapes with others, with non-human animals, with bears, with amphibians, with birds, and so on, because the people have established voluntarily protective measures for these animals, and they take care of wood pastures, which are one of the most diverse, biodiversity-rich territories in Europe, and one of the oldest land uses as well. And you can find them mostly in Transylvania in this kind of locations. So a couple of principles are very relevant from the manifesto, but I think some others do not really fit perfectly the situation.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for answering also brilliantly this question, George. And you actually said some principles are not really fitting in your research, and this is actually my second question, which is kind of the opposite of the first one. And my question is, in your opinion, what are the principles that are less likely to be implemented or to be showcased in your research? George wants to start?
I will try. Thanks a lot. I will try to be briefly now, because it's just one principle that I can see not functioning perfectly in this case. And this is Principle 7 about decommodifying biodiversity. We should not consider biodiversity as subject to financialization, offsetting, and intensified extraction. And I think this principle has to be interpreted locally by thinking about scales, because these villagers, this territory of life, does not have necessarily conservation as a priority goal. Conservation is not central for the livelihoods of people living in the area. It's mostly a byproduct of the ways in which some resources are governed locally through collective arrangements. I talk here about traditional grazing or by domestic animals such as cows and sheep in these complex silvopastoral systems. I talk about extraction of firewood to meet the local needs for heating and cooking of the local people, collection of medicinal and healing plants, and so on. There are clear rules to access these resources by taking into account the sustainability, this quiet sustainability of the resource and the needs of future generations. But these behaviors are not necessarily motivated by explicit environmental goals, and people try to find value and expect that their labor is valued so that they are not forced to leave or to go somewhere else for work. So there is a sort of commercial exploitation of some of the elements in the territory, but as long as this remains local and is not intensified or does not allow for external big actors that we find already in the region, for example, big meat producers and so on, that are grabbing land and profits are going somewhere else, I think we can still talk about a quiet sustainability that is happening on the ground.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. Like the term you use, quiet sustainability, it's really describes perfectly how sometimes you can do conservation without even, having it as a priority. So thank you so much for bringing an example of it. So Revati, if you want to answer the question.
Yeah. Yes. So actually following up from George's point as well, this is a context that it has a ton of wildlife tourism, along with a lot of mountain tourism, because it's set in the foothills of the Himalayas in North India. So historically, it's seen different types of tourism going on, right? So, and the state of Uttarakhand, where Corbett Tiger Reserve is located, is also promoting itself as a ecotourism state, as a state of religious tourism. So there's forms that there's levels of promotion of tourism and therefore commodification of nature that's taking place. So I feel that is somehow that's in the vision of something like a tiger reserve and the state of Uttarakhand, it seems like a little bit of a far-fetched idea that something like decommodification of nature will take place in this context. But another more relevant or equally relevant point I thought was also manifesto point, I think it was 10, where there was about confronting broader social, political, economic influences and powerful systems that actually inhibit convivial conservation. I feel that's also relevant here because, breaking away from a rigid kind of a conservation structure and really thinking about how industrial elite societies or groups are contributing to the broader problems. It's all relevant. It's all tied up with something like a tiger reserve especially because there are tourists who keep coming and want to be in nature. And these are fairly elite tourists, right? So the contrast is strong. But for that, some to break away, as going with the other point about decommodification, I feel like those are really connected because how do you make the people really understand that what they are, coming there for is something that is part of a larger problem, the reason why they're going there for as well. And it's not necessarily actually helping the wildlife or local communities per se, as it's been imposed, in the ecotourism narratives and even tiger reserves, because all tiger reserves in India are also promoted as a wildlife tourism site because a lot of income comes from there. So I feel like those are a little sticky points about shifting that part of the structure, so to speak. But there are ways that one could think of where education and awareness can come in as well.
Thank you very much. I completely agree. I think education for kind of implementing these points is something that it's a good suggestion. I think that it's complicated, of course, trying to implement all these different points in a conservation-related scenario. So on this note, I would like to shift to more of a political economic question. So my next question is, what political and economic challenges hindered or hinder the success of conservation strategies currently implemented in your research scenario? Yeah, whoever wants to start for this one.
I could go on because I have something very clear in mind. Of course, there are different challenges that these commons face across Europe in these alternative ways of doing conservation. But one of them, maybe it's the restrictive and inflexible legislation that we have at the national level. Convivial conservation is not one of the recognized forms of doing conservation, as I mentioned, and the European legislation does not recognize it as such as well. So there are important efforts to be made to recognize these locally conserved areas, maybe such as ICCAs, like indigenous conserved areas, like the ICCA consortium proposes, or territories of life, which allow for a more general definition. So steps are to be made in that respect. And related to this inflexible local legislation, national legislation could be the way in which local authorities do not necessarily collaborate with national authorities when they have to deal with negative human-wildlife conflicts. In the area about which I'm talking about, we have a large population of brown bears, which since 2016 have been strictly protected. The legislation did not catch up with this strict level of protection, so there are not enough very clear ways of dealing with bear attacks. So sometimes people are forced to take matters into their own hands in order to protect their lives or their livelihoods and so on. So maybe this mismatch between the local needs and the pressure from the national legislation could be one of the biggest challenges that we can talk about.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Revati?
Yeah, I think very similar to George, right? Because the protected area system in India is also, again, a British legacy, taken from the Yellowstone model. So I think that entire legacy or state of mind, in that sense, it's entirely the politics of it also. And something like the tiger is the national animal. So how do you shift that mindset of putting a huge kind of primary predator species that is the, a symbol of the national pride into something that involves and makes space for people who are living there in an equitable way, right? Like, how do you change that narrative and the vision of when you think about a tiger, how many of us really think about the villagers who are living there?
Yeah.
And that's probably not most of us, because we are also taught in schools as what's the national animal? That's the tiger. What's the national bird? That's a peacock. There's no contextualizing of people. So at a much deeper level, it is of course the politics in the sense of the political economy, because the tiger also brings in so much recognition to each state, but also India as a country, because it has the largest number of population. And Corbett Tiger Reserve also has the highest tiger population in wild in India right now, based on the last survey. So it's really, a case of superlatives. There's so much happening. It's the oldest, it's the first, and there's most tigers. So it really needs a very deeper shift, and the political economic thinking has to really change to accommodate other lives and other ways of being. And that has to come in a sense from ground up, of course, but not to put the burden from ground up, as the convivial vision also calls for, because they've been saying this for generations now. And that goes back to the previous question about education and awareness, because if it is already a site for tourism, how do we make the ecotourism, education tourism in a way that it's not just about the wildlife and the birds, but also talking about the people and saying that, hey, you're from cities that actually promote a very industrial, consumptive lifestyle without, of course, making people feel bad about how they're living, right? It doesn't have to be constantly pointing fingers. I think we need to move away from that sort of mindset as well. So really to talk to people about that and discuss as a part of, education, as a part of rural, like living in rural areas and things like that. It's not just about seeing people as they are museum entities, right? It's about really thinking more about our own lives. And so it's a much deeper level of connection. And I think most of the manifesto points also, kind of connect to that or relate to that as well, at a broader level. But I would say that because of this case specific, I would also say that even if something like the Forest Rights Act, which is very progressive and it has been implemented in India, there have been cases where caste and gender identities have not benefited from the Forest Rights Act, right? So even if it's a convivial vision that's promoted in a space, we are likely to miss out on these micro identities, which are not micro because they're related to the structure, of course. And so again, that I think needs to be more explicit for any kind of convivial work to also make it more productive and constructive in the context.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you both for answering the political, economic question, which was probably the main one of today. So my other question will be about now, how has the situation changed? Maybe Revati can go first.
Yeah, sure. So, unfortunately, not has changed in the context of the forest villagers. In terms of also Forest Rights Act recognition in the state of Uttarakhand, where Corbett is, there's also very little actual legal rights that are being given. So it's poorly performing as a state in that sense as well. And even in terms of rights and women's work and caste-based discrimination, not much has really changed right now. There are organizations who keep trying to work with them for accessing legal avenues and legal rights, but no success as such right now.
Okay, so hopefully in the near future we'll hear more of developments. George, what about your situation?
Very similarly to what Revati is explaining to us, at the national level, not much has changed. these commons are still not necessarily considered as doing conservation work, but forest management at the local level. But on the other hand, there have been a couple of developments. First, seeing the importance of having this international visibility for the conservation work that they are doing, which we started together with my colleagues Monica Vasile, Ana Varga, Irina Opincaru, when we tried to say that yes, these commons are territories of life, they could be considered ICCAs. So they were emboldened by this kind of visibility. And 2 years ago, they self-organized a local symposium, which combined traditional knowledge and scientists who gave presentations and so on to document more the role of local commons in conservation. They were both Romanians and Hungarians, so it also had this multicultural kind of dimension. And they discussed together ways of taking these synergies further by persuading the national authorities to recognize the conservation work that commons are doing and so on. So this is one important development that I think our territories of life case and these publications like these ones fostered. And another very practical, logistical development that happened last year, the access routes to this village have been asphalted, so they have been modernized, and now they don't feel as marginalized as in the past and as forgotten by the authorities. And with asphalt, there are more economic opportunities that appear in the village. Villagers have greater access to nearby schools, to hospitals in Rupea, and so on. So this is very important when we talk about a very marginalized community that tries to hold together.
That sounds, in fact, really important developments of there. So, I think we're glad to hear how it's a positive development going on, and hopefully there will be many more in the future. My last question related to your study case and related to convivial conservation is about priorities, setting up priorities. So what is the number one priority that should be tackled to successfully reach a convivial conservation? So George, can you go first?
Of course, there are many things that we can work on, and many things the authorities can work on as well. But I think one of the most important issue is to recognize the conservation work that these actors are doing, because they are the stewards of the local territory, and they have been doing this for centuries, despite communism, nationalization, land grabbing, and so on, which happened historically, and all sorts of other enclosures. And they have these challenges in the current moment as well. But by recognizing that they are conservation actors, it would put them on an equal footing with other actors that are very relevant in conservation, like big international green NGOs and so on. They will be invited at the table when decisions are taken and so on. And this is extremely important because people feel this sense of loss, of losing control over decision making and not being invited at the table, but being on the menu.
Perfectly explained. Thank you so much. Revati?
Yeah, I would still say that land rights and access to the forest for those who don't have that is the priority for villagers living around the Corbett Tiger Reserve, because there are revenue villages which actually you do have land rights. Right, so you do have the right to own land and have farming and all of that, but it would be important for the forest villagers to actually be granted the right to live there and actually access the forest for their needs. And if they want to be relocated, whoever needs to do that or wants to be doing that. But again, it has to happen in consultation, but also as one of the manifesto also says, direct democracy. So to involve the people in the process of even thinking of maybe other creative ways that they think would be even more of a priority than what I'm saying, based on the current situation or based on something that, their lived realities that's changed in the past 2 years. So I would also love to have them answering this question in a sense. But from what I've seen and what I have been told, this is also definitely an important point and a priority right now, and to also give the rights to land to the women, because inheritance is patriarchal, even though it's changing a bit, but to actually have the woman's name on that, legal document is really important, and then shifting caste dynamics as well.
Thank you. So addressing the micropolitics we were talking about. And I just wanted to say I feel, these two different studies from India and from Romania. It's how very different countries, but how the main message, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of giving the spotlight to the right people, to the people that need it. Before saying goodbye, I would like to ask you one more question, which is more of a curiosity question, fun question. To Revati, I would like to ask something about the tiger reserve. So any curiosity about related to tigers that you want to share with us?
What's interesting is that Corbett Tiger Reserve, it's named after Jim Corbett, who was a colonial officer, but later on he developed this kind of affinity to nature and just conservation. So his legacy in that sense has come down to Corbett because of the name as well, Corbett Tiger Reserve, and he used to live around this landscape in Uttarakhand state. But the village where he actually ended up spending the most time, that's called Choti Haldwani, and that's actually called as the Corbett village because all the villagers there have like grandfathers or their fathers who remember Jim Corbett and saying, oh yeah, this is the gun he gave us, or he used to come here and, like talk about conserving nature or having, like farming a certain way and things like that. So actually that village has so many different stories about Jim Corbett himself, and there's a very different kind of a feel that they give about Jim Corbett, because in a sense they all have land and rights and farming and all of that. But the Jim Corbett Tiger Reserve and the villages around them don't have the same historical memory with Corbett because it's so detached. So I think that's an interesting paradox in a sense also.
Yes, that's actually really interesting. Thank you for sharing this little knowledge, did you know fact with us. George, I would like to ask you about bears. In the chapter, there's a mention of bear-human conflicts next to the commons area. So what's the situation now with this conflict?
Thank you, Eliana. Talking about bears is one of my favorite things. I could go on forever, and all my friends and relatives are just sick of me talking about the bears. Romania has a very big population of brown bears because we are talking about brown bears. It's the biggest in Europe. Anything between 8,000 and 15,000, depending on the source. Of course, conflicts appear and interactions that are negative appear and depredation appear, but this does not mean that there is no coexistence. People in rural areas, and Romania is a deeply rural area of Eastern Europe, have devised this kind of mechanisms of interacting with bears. Transhumance is extremely important in mitigating these conflicts, and the use of large guarding dogs and so on. But according to me, from what I saw in this area, in the village that I'm talking about, Homorod Korochoni Folva, one of the biggest challenges is the enclosures of the wood pastures, because bears love open landscapes, and open pastures are vast mosaic ecosystems, and bears love to feed on ants, to feed on fallen fruits from these trees and so on, and to be mobile during the day and during the night and so on. Now, because we have meat industry penetrating the area, and we have fences erected on these wood pastures, this diminishes the mobility of bears, and bears end up either in the village or where they should not be, or where they are not happy to be. So this is something unexpected, this friction between land grabbing for meat industry and the mobility of bears in the landscape that have been living convivially with the locals for centuries. So this is one of the things that needs further attention, and of course it creates lots of divisions locally.
Interesting. Thank you. This is perfectly in line with convivial conservation. So thank you very much for answering this curiosity question. And this is the end of this first episode of Convivial Conservation around the globe. So I would like to thank you, both Revati and George, for taking part to this very first episode. It was a pleasure to hear about your research. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eliana. Thank you, Revati.
Thank you, Eliana. Yes, thank you, George, as well. This was a nice conversation about conservation. Yeah.
If you liked this episode, make sure to stay tuned for new episodes which will be released soon. And if you want to know more about convivial conservation, make sure to check out our website, Convivial Conservation, where you can also find more information about our manifesto. If you want to know more about the chapters, make sure to read the online available book, Convivial Conservation from Principle to Practice. Thank you for listening and see you next time.